Sarah lived in a quiet neighborhood in Oregon, a place where trees lined the streets and evenings were calm. She had been married to Michael for nearly 2 decades. Their marriage had once been full of energy, laughter, and late-night talks, but over the years, life had changed. Michael's career grew more demanding, and he spent long hours at work, often coming home tired and distracted. Sarah never complained, but she felt the silence in her heart. She missed the warmth of a glance across the dinner table, the surprise flowers, the small gestures that used to make her feel loved. Their only son, Daniel, had moved out years ago to build his life in the city. But recently, he returned home after a difficult break in his career. Sarah welcomed him with open arms. She was thrilled to have him back, to cook for him again, to see his shoes by the door and hear his voice in the house. His presence filled the quiet rooms, but it also stirred feelings Sarah wasn't ready for. Daniel was no longer the boy who left home. He was a man now, confident, independent, and thoughtful. He carried himself differently, spoke with assurance, and looked at her with a maturity that sometimes unsettled her. She noticed how he held doors open for her, how he complimented her cooking, and how he laughed at her old stories as if they were brand new. It wasn't unusual for a son to admire his mother, but something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes lingered, made Sarah's heart stumble in ways she didn't want to admit. One evening, Sarah stood in the kitchen making dinner. The soft hum of rain tapped against the windows. Daniel walked in, leaned against the counter, and watched her quietly. She felt his gaze before he even spoke. "You always make this house feel warm," he said, his voice gentle. She turned, caught off guard by his words. A simple compliment, yet it sank into her like something deeper. She laughed lightly to push away the weight of the moment, but her heart skipped a beat. From then on, Sarah became aware of little things. At dinner, she noticed Daniel's eyes lingering on her face, as if memorizing her expressions. In conversations, his voice carried a softness, a warmth that seemed to reach beyond ordinary words. When they sat together in the living room, watching the fire glow, she felt an unfamiliar closeness. She told herself it was nothing, that her mind was simply tired, that loneliness was weaving illusions around her, but Sarah couldn't ignore the ache that grew inside her. Michael's absence left her yearning for companionship, and Daniel's return filled that empty space with something she hadn't felt in years: attention, presence, and unspoken care. She tried to bury the thoughts, reminding herself of the boundary that could never be crossed. But the heart doesn't always obey rules. It was during a quiet evening on the porch that Sarah truly sensed the change. Michael was working late as usual, and Daniel brought 2 mugs of tea outside. They sat together, the soft glow of the porch light surrounding them, the night air cool against their skin. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts neither dared to say aloud. Sarah looked at him, her son, and for a moment she saw not the boy she raised, but a man who reminded her of the love she once had with Michael. She pulled her gaze away quickly, her chest tightening. She knew this was dangerous ground. She couldn't allow her heart to wander where it didn't belong. Yet deep inside, she felt the storm beginning, a storm she wasn't sure she had the strength to stop. That night, when Sarah lay in bed, she replayed every detail. Daniel's compliment, his quiet smile, the way his presence filled the house. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was lonely and reading too much into small gestures. But her heart whispered otherwise. Sarah's life had always been about being a wife and mother, giving her best to her family and keeping her home steady. Yet now she faced a truth she could not ignore. Something was shifting inside her, something that made her both fearful and alive. And as she closed her eyes, one thought echoed in her mind. What if the boundary she relied on was not as unshakable as she believed? The rain had not stopped all morning. Drops tapped against the windows like a steady rhythm, filling the quiet house with a calm yet heavy mood. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing tea, her hands moving automatically, when she felt someone enter. She turned slightly and saw Daniel leaning against the counter. His arms were crossed, his expression relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on her. "You always make this house feel like home," he said softly. His words were simple, but they landed differently. Sarah paused, holding the teapot for a moment too long. She smiled, forcing a light laugh to break the tension. "It's just tea," she replied. But inside, her chest tightened. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was harmless. But from that moment, she became more aware of Daniel. His presence wasn't just comforting anymore, it was unsettling in ways she couldn't explain. When she set the table that evening, she noticed his gaze following her, lingering longer than it should. When she spoke, he listened with a focus she rarely felt from Michael anymore. At dinner, the three of them sat together, but Michael quickly excused himself, saying he had calls to finish. That left Sarah and Daniel alone. The candlelight flickered between them, and Sarah found herself nervous, fumbling with her fork as Daniel asked questions about her day, her hobbies, even her childhood. He wanted to know everything, and his attention was warm, almost too warm. She answered, trying to keep her tone steady, but a part of her felt exposed. Later that night, Sarah stood by the living room window watching the rain. Daniel joined her, silent at first, then said, "It feels peaceful here. I didn't realize how much I missed this." His words carried an emotion that unsettled her again. She turned quickly, giving a short nod before excusing herself to bed earlier than usual. She told herself distance was best, but distance was not easy. In the days that followed, Sarah noticed patterns. Small things, subtle but real. When she entered the room, Daniel's eyes followed her. When she laughed at something, he smiled as if her joy alone was enough. Once, while she reached for a book on the shelf, he stood too close, and their shoulders brushed. It was nothing, just an accident, but it left her unsettled for hours. Sarah kept telling herself this was just her imagination. She was lonely, and loneliness made her see things differently. Michael's absence had left a gap, and Daniel's presence filled it. She clung to that explanation, but her heart wasn't convinced. Every time Daniel looked at her with that steady gaze, her pulse betrayed her. One evening, Michael worked late again. Sarah and Daniel ate dinner together on the porch. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. They talked about his life in the city, his struggles, his hopes for the future. Sarah listened, her heart swelling with pride and something else she didn't want to name. When the conversation faded, silence wrapped around them. Daniel sipped his tea, then set it down. His eyes met hers, and this time he didn't look away. Sarah felt her breath catch. Something unspoken passed between them, something heavy, dangerous, and undeniable. She looked down quickly, her hands trembling slightly. That night, lying awake, she couldn't escape the memory of that look. It wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was real. Daniel had looked at her differently, not as a son should look at his mother, but as a man looks at someone he desires. The realization shook her deeply. The next morning, she tried to return to normal. She cooked breakfast, cleaned, kept herself busy, but every glance Daniel gave her carried weight. When he brushed past her in the hallway, her heart jumped. When he complimented her cooking again, she heard more in his tone than just gratitude. Sarah wanted to draw a line, to make things clear, but the words wouldn't come. She was afraid that speaking it aloud would make it real. Instead, she pretended, acting as though nothing had changed, while inside, everything had shifted. The storm inside her grew stronger each day. She knew this was a dangerous path, one that could destroy the family she had built. Yet she also knew she had been starved of attention, of care, of being seen. Daniel's presence was like a mirror reflecting back the woman she used to be, alive, cherished, noticed. And so, Sarah walked a fragile line. She cooked, cleaned, laughed, and smiled, but in her heart, she carried the weight of a secret she couldn't name. She knew boundaries existed for a reason, but every glance, every quiet moment with Daniel tested those boundaries. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. The days passed quickly, but the tension inside the house grew heavier. Sarah tried to distract herself with chores, errands, and phone calls to friends, but none of it silenced the thoughts running in her mind. She had noticed how Daniel looked at her, how his words carried warmth that went beyond a son's affection. She told herself to ignore it, yet she couldn't. Every time she caught his eyes, something inside her stirred. It began with conversations. At first, they were simple. Stories about his childhood, updates about friends from the city, casual remarks about movies or books. But slowly their talks grew deeper. Sarah found herself telling him about her fears, the emptiness she felt when Michael worked late, and the way she sometimes felt invisible in her own marriage. Daniel listened, not with the distracted nods she often got from Michael, but with full attention. He leaned forward, asked questions, and looked at her as if every word mattered. The connection was subtle at first, but undeniable. She realized that she was sharing more with Daniel than she had shared with her husband in years. One evening, as they washed dishes together, Sarah spoke about the dreams she once had. Dreams of traveling, of painting, of writing stories. Daniel looked at her with admiration. "You should still do those things," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." Her heart softened at his words. No one had told her that in a long time. She smiled, but it was a smile filled with longing, the kind that carried both gratitude and ache. The closeness deepened in quiet ways. Sarah began to notice his compliments. They weren't just about her cooking anymore. One afternoon, while she stood in the garden arranging flowers, Daniel said, "You look beautiful when you do that." The word beautiful caught her off guard. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as a casual remark, but his tone told her it wasn't casual at all. From then on, the smallest gestures carried weight. When their hands brushed while passing a plate, Sarah felt her chest tighten. When he helped her reach for a heavy box, his closeness made her step back quickly, afraid of the electricity she felt. It wasn't physical in action, but emotional in meaning. They had crossed into a space where the air felt charged, where every glance, every touch, every word meant something more than it should. One evening, Michael called to say he would be staying late at work again. Sarah sat on the couch with Daniel, the television playing in the background, though neither of them was watching. Their conversation started with casual topics, but then grew personal. Daniel asked her, "Are you happy, Mom?" The question froze her. She wanted to say yes, but the truth caught in her throat. She hesitated before replying. "I don't know anymore." Her voice trembled as the words slipped out. Daniel's eyes softened, and for a moment, the silence between them felt too heavy to bear. Their bond was no longer safe. Sarah knew it. She had crossed the line the moment she let her heart confide in him in ways she couldn't with her husband. It wasn't physical betrayal, it was emotional. But in many ways, it felt just as dangerous. The turning point came during another quiet evening. They were cleaning up after dinner, moving around the kitchen side by side. Sarah reached to take a dish from him, and their hands touched. She froze. This time, instead of pulling away instantly, she looked up. Daniel was already looking at her. His eyes carried something unspoken, something raw and full of feeling. Her heart raced. For a second, it felt as though the world had gone still. No rain outside, no clock ticking, no sounds at all. Just the intensity of that look. It lasted only a moment before Sarah quickly pulled her hand back, turning away. She could barely breathe. She hurried to her room afterward, closing the door behind her. She leaned against it, her chest rising and falling fast. Tears filled her eyes. She knew this couldn't continue. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, and one more step would destroy everything she had built her whole life. But knowing the danger didn't erase the truth. Her heart had already been touched. The following days were harder. Sarah avoided being alone with Daniel, but it was impossible in a house where they lived together. She cooked meals quickly, spoke in shorter sentences, and busied herself with chores. Yet every time she avoided his gaze, she felt his silence pressing in. He too knew what was happening. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but both felt the weight of it. Daniel's words became fewer, but his actions spoke more. He helped her around the house, stayed close when she needed something, and carried a quiet tenderness that only made her heart ache more. Sarah wished she could rewind time, return to the simplicity of mother and son without the shadow of forbidden feelings. But reality didn't bend backward. She found herself lying awake at night, questioning everything. Was it her loneliness that made her vulnerable? Was it Daniel's maturity that blurred the lines? Or was it the years of neglect in her marriage that opened a space where something dangerous could grow? One thought tormented her most. This had not yet gone too far, but it was close. Too close. She could still stop it. But stopping it meant confronting the truth, not just with Daniel, but with herself. And Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for that. Because once the truth was spoken, there would be no turning back. The tension had reached its peak. Sarah could no longer pretend nothing was happening. Every glance, every shared silence with Daniel felt like standing too close to a fire. She wanted to step back, but part of her lingered in the warmth. She told herself it was only emotions, only loneliness. But she knew better. If she didn't act soon, the line would break completely. One evening, Sarah sat at the dining table long after dinner, staring at her untouched tea. Michael had stayed late at work again, leaving the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock. Daniel walked in and stopped when he saw her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Mom, we need to talk." Her heart pounded. She tried to smile to brush it off, but he didn't let her. He stepped closer, his eyes carrying both fear and courage. "I don't know why, but I feel something I shouldn't," he confessed. His words fell heavy in the room, shattering the silence that had been stretching between them for weeks. Sarah's breath caught. She felt tears press against her eyes. This was the moment she had been dreading, the truth spoken aloud. She shook her head, forcing strength into her voice even as it trembled. "Daniel, no! We cannot go down this path. Whatever you feel, whatever I've let myself feel, it has to stop now." He looked hurt, almost broken, but he didn't argue. He only whispered, "I just wanted you to know." Then he stepped back, leaving her at the table, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. That night, Sarah lay awake, replaying the moment over and over. She realized how close she had come to losing everything. It wasn't just about her marriage, though that was fragile. It was about her role as a mother, the foundation of her family. If she allowed her loneliness to rule her, she would destroy not only her life, but also Daniel's. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She sat with Michael at breakfast, looking at him closely. He was tired, distracted, scrolling through his phone. For a moment, she almost stayed silent, but then she spoke. "Michael, we need to talk." He looked up, surprised by her serious tone. She told him how she felt, how distant their marriage had become, how forgotten she felt, how she missed the closeness they once had. She didn't mention Daniel, but her words carried the urgency of someone on the edge. At first, Michael seemed defensive, but when he saw the tears in her eyes, something softened. He put his phone aside, reaching for her hand for the first time in months. "I didn't realize how far I'd drifted," he admitted. It was not a complete solution, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Sarah felt hope. Meanwhile, Daniel began to withdraw quietly. He no longer lingered in conversations. He avoided long silences, avoided moments that could carry hidden meaning. Sarah noticed and knew it was for the best. The unspoken connection they had shared needed space to dissolve, and distance was the only way. Within a few weeks, Daniel made the decision to move out again, saying he wanted to rebuild his life in the city. Sarah understood. It was painful but necessary. The day he left, she hugged him tightly, holding back tears. "I love you," she said, her voice heavy with both truth and boundaries. He nodded, his expression filled with emotions he didn't speak. Then he was gone, leaving the house quieter but safer. In the weeks that followed, Sarah focused on her marriage. She and Michael began to take evening walks again, simple but meaningful. They talked more, shared stories over dinner, and little by little the wall between them started to crumble. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She realized that if she wanted love, she couldn't wait silently for it. She had to fight for it, nurture it, and demand it. Still, there were nights when Sarah thought back to the storm she had faced. The memory of Daniel's gaze, the closeness they had almost crossed into, stayed with her like a scar. It wasn't a wound she wanted to revisit, but it was one she would never forget. It reminded her how fragile the human heart could be, how easily loneliness could blur the lines of love. and how important it was to protect the bonds that mattered most. She learned that real strength was not in giving in to desire, but in pulling back, even when it hurt. She chose her family, her marriage, and her integrity over the dangerous comfort of temptation. Years later, when she looked back, she remembered it not as a story,